Welcome all, and thanks for joining the second session of our March-April webinar series on racism as we continue our journey toward the goal of nourishing of life for all. Rod, could you please mute everyone's microphones? This will be our only webinar in April. However, the team will be participating in Beyond the Walls online worship service on Sunday, April 24th. The theme is God's Shalom for all creation. Please note that this is a very different time than our normal activities. We've tried to identify the time zones, start times in different areas, but be sure and check on your own location. The Beyond the Walls website is centerplace.ca. Note the Canadian spelling of center. On March 20th, we began going deeper into eco-racism and environmental racism. As Joan reminded us last time, this is not something new. It's been happening for centuries. What is new and urgent are the ways in which climate change is disproportionately affecting communities already struggling with systematic environmental and economic oppression. In the March 20 session, Rod explored the roots of this issue in colonialism. Susan shared the story of the Southern Pacific island of Makatea with its history of colonialist extraction of minerals and the attempt of its citizens to find a path forward amid complex alternatives. Paul shared with us the struggle of the indigenous community on Hawaii's island of Oahu to protect its water from continued contamination from the Navy fuel storage facility. And Joan explained the disproportionate impact of urban heat islands on the poor and minority communities. We've learned that the communities in these stories are treated as sacrifice zones, places where the land and the people are considered of little value and are sacrificed to economic greed and neglect. The stories add dimension to the classic definition of eco-racism. Intentional or unintentional racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, enforcement of regulations and laws, and targeting of communities for the disposal of toxic waste and siting of polluting industries. To this definition, we must add economic suppression, biodiversity loss, food insecurity, the loss of spiritual, cultural, and health benefits when people are pushed from their homes and communities. We see that primarily Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are the most adversely affected by the increasing pollution, extreme heat, and flooding. We must remind ourselves that this pattern of disproportionate impact is continuing, and we must act to change that. Today, we'll hear from Paul about a multinational corporation, Formosa Plastics, and its impact on Texas, Vietnam, and Louisiana, and Brad's Louisiana experience in what is called Cancer Alley. Lori will then close and bring us back to our heart source as we reflect and consider how we might step into activism. But to start us off, Dean will share the story of our experience in environmental racism in a neighborhood in Des Moines, Iowa, 50 years ago, and how it has impacted that community today and its relationship to future climate challenges. Following Dean's story, there's an opportunity to hear your stories. What examples of eco-racism are you aware of? What's happening in your city, province, state, or country? What has the Spirit brought to your awareness? Prepare to share 3 or 4 sentence summary of your stories. Dean?
This is a story about a neighborhood that Susie and I came to know in 1969 as the Southeast Bottoms of Des Moines. Now it's known in 2019 local real estate brochures as Capitol View South, offering what real estate marketers now call a dense suburban feel. This is the story of the neighborhood's history and what transpired in those 50 years. Des Moines, Iowa sits at the confluence of two rivers, the Des Moines coming in from the north and the Raccoon from the west. And this recent image from Google Earth provides a canvas for describing the history of civic neglect and oppression of BIPOC communities in Des Moines. If you're old enough, you know about the history of urban renewal and freeway construction from the 50s. In Des Moines, the first urban renewal project cleared low-income neighborhoods for the freeway through town, which you can see right through the middle of this image, and for the development of hotels and businesses attracted by that freeway. By the 1960s, there was outcry about displaced poor people, mostly Black and Latino, from housing without any compensation during that urban renewal process. The result was a new program called Model Cities, which added social services and rental relocation assistance to the mix of federal support. And it was paired with new low-cost housing construction for people to move to and other neighborhood improvement projects. In Des Moines, the Model Cities neighborhood was just north of the old urban renewal area, and many families pushed out of urban renewal had moved there. But there was another neighborhood, much older and more stable, called the Roadside neighborhood, also known as the Southeast Bottoms, for obvious reasons. It was river bottom land just downstream of the confluence of the two rivers, and its residents had lived there for decades, little affected by urban renewal and its forced migration. And it's that neighborhood I want to talk about now. Here's a slightly zoomed in view from the previous image. The downtown business center is here with its high rises, a major center of the national insurance industry. And the Roadside neighborhood is here. Now let's talk about rivers and levees to protect the two areas. The levee system shown in green is built high to protect the valuable downtown properties. And by the way, the Capital District here on the right, on the east side of the Des Moines River. Downstream, below the confluence, the levees are lower, offering less protection to the Roadside neighborhood, the Southeast Bottoms. We've talked about sacrifice zones, and this neighborhood is an example. And by the way, that little golden circle in the upper right is the state capitol building. We'll come back to that. But this sets the stage for our story. In the summer of 1969, a civil rights activist named Jim Dunn, who'd been hired by the United Church of Christ, recruited us to do community organizing in the Roadside neighborhood. Over the previous 3 years, he'd worked with the local medical school to open a free clinic in the neighborhood. But housing was to be the next issue. I brought a group of students from Union Theological Seminary for the summer, but Susie and I stayed on afterwards to continue. We lived upstairs in the old house where the neighborhood health clinic was set up and set about getting to know the people.
I remember one older Latino couple in the neighborhood, Louise and Manuel, who took us under their wings. Louise would invite us to dinner frequently, and we'd sit on the porch afterward and listen to Manuel's stories. Louise would keep us making sure that our lemonade was filled to the rim the whole time. It was a very warm experience at their home.
So we were organizing around building new low-cost housing for people in the neighborhood. It was a wonderful, diverse neighborhood with 80% of the houses owner-occupied. But that meant they'd been sold on contract by slumlords who repossessed and resold them at the slightest breach of contract, with the contract buyers losing their equity. Many homes in roadside had no running water and got their water from this horse trough in the center of the neighborhood.
That horse trough was a gathering place. My memory was that it was a happy place where people congregated and chatted and gossiped throughout the day and into the evening as they gathered their containers of water.
Many streets had no sewer lines, so those homes had outhouses. And again, this is 1969. The neighborhood had been marked by banks as a place not to make home loans. The practice called redlining. The city had reinforced this practice by designating the neighborhood to become industrial, despite the stability and diversity of its residents. Again, a sacrifice zone. There had been no new housing built in the 50 years prior to 1969, and contract owners couldn't get loans to improve their property. And every day, those in the neighborhood could contemplate their circumstance with the gold leaf covered dome of the Capitol in plain sight. You can see it there in the background behind the water trough. And here it is, up close, gold leaf covered and shining in brilliance for all to see. This is the roadside neighborhood in a 2022 view. In 1969, it had none of the improvements we see in this image. No broad boulevards separated by a median, no new housing, no new school or recreation center in this image. And there were several vacant lots where old homes had been condemned because there were no loans for improvement. So we planned a self-help sweat equity project and organized 6 families in the first self-help group. We acquired lots with some church donated money, and we got blueprints drawn up by a local architect. The homes would be financed with low interest federal loans. We submitted all paperwork through the local savings and loan, and then waited a year while the bureaucrats looked for every way possible to deny the applications. It was my earliest lesson in systemic racism. The chief of the Federal Housing Administration office in Des Moines finally just said, "These houses are just too good for these people." By the time of approval, all but one family had moved on. So we organized a crew of volunteers to help that family build their home. And here from a current image is the house we built. It was built for a large family, and it has 6 bedrooms and 2.5 baths on a 1/3 acre lot. It sits squarely in the middle of the neighborhood. It broke the lending and zoning red line and opened the opportunity for development. Levees were ultimately raised and other flood control improvements made. However, it's a mixed story. Over the ensuing 50 years, it has also gone through the process of gentrification. If we had been able to build homes with the original 6 self-help families, and for additional groups of families, they would have built equity and benefited from that gentrification process. Now, some low-cost housing has been built. This block to the left of the house we originally built is new low-cost housing. It does have a new school, right here above that housing area. It has a new community center, kind of hidden by these trees, but with a pool. And there's a community garden right over here against the levee. And a new rental high-rise rising above the river. Now, what's the relevance of this story to our climate crisis? It's this. Past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior for institutions and society, as well as for individuals. Unless we intervene, the adaptation efforts in response to the climate crisis will favor the privileged, the well-off, over the poorer and marginalized groups in our communities. Extreme weather events will again confront Des Moines and other communities with flooding challenges, both inland on river systems and in coastal areas. And it'll be our responsibility to assure that adaptation investments are equitably applied. And by the way, this horse trough is now on the National Registry of Historic Places. And the surrounding small park is named after one of the early slum landlords in the old neighborhood. So as Susie mentioned, I want to give a chance for those of you who are on the call to share any stories that you might have of what you're aware of as examples of eco-racism in your communities or in your experience. What's happening in your city, in your province, state, or country, and what has the Spirit brought to your awareness because of those instances? And if you would, I'll stop sharing the screen now and would invite you, any of you, just to share in a brief 4 or 5 sentences, any stories that you might have to share. Feel free to unmute yourselves. Did I see someone raise their? Susan.
Yeah, Sound Transit here in Seattle has proposed an extension into West Seattle, SoDo, and the International District. And I just spoke this last week at a hearing for community, concerns about how the proposed extension was going to impact the China district, the International District, and China's district, unproportionately displacing families there rather than other areas. And I just brought that to their attention. Now, what will come from that, I don't know, but I was not the only voice speaking. So again, it's just the marginalized being invisible.
Kathy? Kathy Sharp, you got your hand up? And you're not, and you're muted.
Yes, okay. So my example was going to be Sound Transit as well as our transportation system. And I am in the same basic region that Susan Oxley is, in the Puget Sound region of Greater Seattle. So clearly, traditional African-American neighborhoods were broken up by some of the I-5 construction, particularly where we now have Rainier Valley, actually, which is where one of our churches is located. But also with Sound Transit, they decided to add a train stop in the Rainier Valley, which sounds great because that is one of the most diverse zip codes in America. And that all sounds great, but they were putting in their train stop in a very, very busy transportation hub. And what the people there wanted was some kind of an overpass, because they thought that people would likely be hit crossing the tracks. And Sound Transit was unwilling to do that, though they made huge accommodations in the wealthier neighborhoods, even adding a stop. And in fact, several people have been hit and some died from their failure to put in an overpass where people could safely walk. And that's in a diverse, immigration-rich neighborhood.
Thank you. Tom, did you have your hand up?
Yes. I live in Bend, Oregon. And in Bend, Oregon, which is a white community, we have a brewery, Deschutes Brewery, sitting on a hill. It's our icon. And they just announced in the local newspaper that they're going to reduce their greenhouse gases by 50% in 10 years or so. And the first thing I thought of, if you're an iconic brewery in Bend, Oregon, why didn't you do this 10 years ago? And so I would actually like a comment on what you just heard. Thank you.
Andrew?
Yes, so in the UK,
You just muted yourself, Andrew.
you hear me now? Yeah. So in the UK, we've seen energy prices just jump to double what they have been. And this has proportionally disaffected the poor in our country, whereas the middle class and upper class can absorb that sort of jump. The low classes are already struggling to make ends meet, are going to really struggle this year. We can see that the debt's going to be colossal. That's happening right now.
Joan?
Yes, in Commerce City, which is a suburb of Denver and about 40 miles from where I live in Johnstown, Colorado, it's an industrial suburb and with a lot of oil refineries and so on. And one of them, I believe by Anadarko, this woman that lives near there, a Hispanic family, she was concerned about her family's health and others were getting sick in the neighborhood. And so she asked about the monitoring of the air quality. And Anadarko said, yes, we're self-monitoring, it's fine. Well, she kept on and the news, the TV stations got a hold of it. And eventually they made enough of a fuss. Now they have an independent study with some monitoring of the air quality. And of course, it's showing that it's dangerous to live there and for their water and everything. It smells. And so I think it helps. Even this young Hispanic woman is able to make a difference by speaking up and having others take her side. So I'm hoping that that will help that neighborhood.
Judy?
Hearing the reports of neighborhoods split with freeways going in and so on reminded me of something that happened in Kansas City when they punched, I think it's I-71, it's a north-south route through. It was going right through a large Black residential neighborhood. And much like what we heard Joan say, there was an older woman who advocated for a change in the plan. They did not move the freeway, but what she was able to do with her advocacy was turn it from a no access freeway to a road with stoplights. So here you are on I-70, interstates normally don't have stoplights, and there are stoplights so the residents can go through the corridor and get from one side of their neighborhood to the other.
Thanks, Judy. Kathy?
I wanted to share something that happened in Los Angeles, and in the early 1900s, there was in Manhattan Beach, which is the Los Angeles beach area, a Black family called the Bruce family owned property right on the beach, and they would invite other Black individuals from Southern California, didn't even know them, come down and stay, and they gave them clothing and food and a beach lodging. And the white area, this is all basically a white area, except for this one block square of land on the beach. And the city decided, Santa Monica area decided to take away the land. They had the KK come in and help them. And they took the land away, saying they wanted to make it into a city park. And so they took the land away. And the Bruce family that were Black left the area and got nothing for it. And this was always been a wrong. And last year, the governor of California had a bill that went to legislation to give this land that was now worth almost $8 million back to the Bruce family. And it got passed, and they did. The Bruce family got their land back.
Wow.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Rosalind, I think you're waving. Did you want to mention something?
Sorry, Susie and Dean, that was applause for Kathy's story.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for
Well,
checking in.
Yeah. I'm looking for anybody else who might have a story. If I don't see your hand, shout out and we'll hear what you have to say. Okay. Not hearing anyone. I'm now going to pass it off to Paul, who will share his screen and give us the story that he's compiled for us. Paul?
Mute myself first. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. So a few weeks ago, Susan shared the term sacrifice zones. The Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, codenamed EPA, refers to sacrifice zones as, quote, for areas negatively impacted by environmental degradation and or pollution that harms nearby residents for broader economic gains elsewhere, unquote. There are many other names to describe these areas. Wrong side of the tracks, or maybe throwaway communities. Areas where residents do not receive equal protection, if any. Another term, LULU, locally unwanted land uses. LULUs are exclusively situated in areas of low income and or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. In this next segment, we'll introduce a company that has countless examples all over the world of creating or exploiting sacrifice zones. And we'll share 3 of those sacrifice zones with you today. Founded in 1954 with aid and loans from U.S. entities, Formosa Plastics is now a multinational conglomerate that worldwide is the 2nd largest producer of polyvinyl chloride resins, what we know of as PVC, and associated plastic compounds. While petrochemicals is their primary focus, they have also branched out into other products. They have a division that produces rayon fiber and yarn, polyester fiber, acrylic fiber. They produce circuit boards, copper-clad laminates. They've invested in steel production, transportation, energy productions, as well as funding several educational and medical organizations. They have production facilities in Taiwan, China, the Philippines, Cambodia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and here in the United States. We don't hear about them that much because they produce the raw components used to create consumer goods. They don't actually produce consumer products themselves. but they produce PVC plastic, a lot of it. Here in North America, they have facilities in New Jersey, Delaware, South Carolina, Louisiana, Illinois, and Texas. So let's start with the sacrifice zone in Seadrift, Texas. Now, Forrest Gump is probably where many of us formed our mental picture of what a shrimp boat captain looks like. So today we'd like to tell you about Diane Wilson, mother of 5 and a 4th-generation shrimp boat captain from Seadrift, Texas. Seadrift sits on the Texas coast about 140 miles south of Houston, 80 miles north of Corpus Christi. The area is home to several sheltered bays, the San Antonio Bay, Lavaca Bay, Cox Bay, Matagordo Bay, and a few others. She claims she grew up on the water, was part of the water. The water has a spirit that's connected to her. Shrimpers learn when they are young to read the water and the weather. She talks about going out before a norther blew in because that's when the shrimp come out of the mud. You feel the level of the tide, the phase of the moon, and you sense the direction the water is telling the shrimp to go in. Diane talks of sleeping on the water, gazing at glass smooth surfaces, reveling in the power of the water when a squall was coming up, and water spouts popping up all around you. She claims one never feels quite as alive as when you're on the water. She describes a sacred trust with the bay. In 1989, concerned about a neighbor's health and watching dolphin die-offs and reduced fishery catches, she read a report that Calhoun County, where she lived, was the #1 county in the nation for toxic waste emissions. Now, following the 1984 Union Carbide toxic chemical release that killed thousands in Bhopal, India, public concern in the U.S. led to the passage of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act in 1986. Section 313 of that act established a Toxic Release Inventory Report, the TRI, requiring manufacturers to report chemical toxins that escape their facilities. It was this report that showed Calhoun County, Texas at the top of the list. Diane realized as the fish and fishing died away, the primary employers and economic generators in the area included DuPont, Union Carbide, Dow Chemical, Alcoa Aluminum, BP Chemical, Carbon Graphite, were wantonly poisoning her community. Diane became involved in environmental issues simply because these companies were destroying her community and her waters.
The finest thing I had going for me. And when I heard that we were #1 in the county, I just spontaneously, because I'm not a linear person. I'm not a planner. I'm not a note taker or devise a plan. That is nothing that I do. But I move spontaneously, and I was so just absolutely horrified with that data. So I just called the meeting. I went down to City Hall and said, we had this little room outside City Hall, and sometimes they had little games there, and sometimes they had a little dance there for the kids there. So I called the meeting. And there was such a backlash from that one simple meeting. To be honest, it caught my curiosity because I could not figure out what was going on, because suddenly I had City Hall, I had the county commissioners, I had the mayors, I had the plant managers coming down and telling me to be a good citizen and not do this. And I was like, do what? What am I doing? It was like I was calling the meeting, and they would say, well, we're having economic development down here, and this is just red flags. This looks like trouble. And I even had the bank president come down to the fish house. I had never spoken to that man a day in my life. And he was down there, and he said I was getting a vigilante group. And I'm like, I'm not doing nothing but calling a meeting. And it was, and suddenly all of the at that time it was like Phil Graham and Lofton, he was a representative at that time, and all of these senators and representatives, suddenly they were on TV and saying, you know, it would just, we just can't have this questioning of industry. And I still, I had no idea what they were talking about. And I got attacked. I would have economic development, chamber of commerce, the mayors, businesses show up and literally disrupt. I mean, they would say I was hysterical. You know, they would say I was hysterical. And they said I was a spy for Louisiana because they never could actually believe I could think of this on my own because, you know, I'm from the little southern rural Texas, and down here they don't think women are smart enough, and especially if you're a fisherman, they think you're kind of stupid. And I've been told that my whole life is like, you stupid woman. So, so you know, here you have these people that just can't believe this is coming from me. It's like, where's she coming from? Somebody's paying her. You know, Louisiana's hiring her to do this, and they never could believe. And maybe that talks about cynicism out there. Is like they cannot believe that someone legitimately cares. It's like, has things gone so bad that there is no legitimate care, that there's always a motive? It's like, what is it you want? What is it you want? And like they was always asking me, it's like, what is it you want? And it was like, it's the Bay. It's like, where are you coming from? It's the Bay. That's where I come from. And so that is where it started. And it was like a rolling stone. And it just kept mushrooming, and it just took over my entire life. It was like,
So that same year, 1989, Diane became aware of a small factory, Formosa Plastics, that had submitted a plan for a $3 billion expansion to their factory, one of the largest expansion investments in the state. So that became one of her first projects to try to figure out what was going on.
the finest thing I had going for me. And at the point that I had read that we were #1 in the nation, I didn't even know who Formosa Plastics was. It wasn't even in the picture. And when I called my first meeting, someone sent me a letter in the mail, and it was just had my name on front. It didn't give their name. All it did was give me a copy that they'd cut out of the newspaper of the public notice for Formosa Plastics to have 7 new air permits. And like I said, I had never saw a public notice before, which is where industry, if you're going to build, you have to let the public know, and they usually put it in the newspaper, and it's usually far in the back with the advertisements and the divorce ads and all this type of stuff. And so someone had sent me that, and so I decided, as a first order of business, we would say we were going to ask for a permit hearing on Formosa Plastics. And apparently, that was the reason why I was having such problems, because Formosa Plastics, they were putting in a $2.7 billion chemical expansion in Texas. It was the biggest Texas had ever had. It was the largest in the United States in 10 years. Phil Graham, who at that time was a congressman and was developing a war chest to be president, he was taking the lead role in bringing this huge multinational corporation into Texas and making sure their permits were okay, their visas were okay, the tax abatements were okay, and the public knew nothing about it. It had been a little business deal that the Texas Department of Commerce was all involved in, the governor was all involved in, but the public knew nothing about. But to get them down here, they had guaranteed their permit. They had said, matter of fact, Phil Graham's campaign manager was the EP administrator up in Dallas, and it covered like 6 states, Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and Arkansas. And so here you got an EPA administrator who's a campaign manager for Phil Gramm. Phil Gramm is going to get all of the benefits of bringing in all of these thousands of jobs for this huge chemical expansion on the Texas Gulf Coast.
So Diane naively thought that the hearings were to talk about the permits allowing a factory to expand. What she figured out later is that against federal law, there would be no environmental impact assessment. The permits were already approved as part of a deal for economic development. She found out that Formosa was a notorious polluter in Taiwan, and our leaders and officials invited them in, no questions asked. The EPA administrator was the campaign manager for the politician ramrodding the deal through legislation. Remember the definition: areas negatively impacted by environmental degradation and or pollution that harms nearby residents for broader economic gains elsewhere. So Diane tried to start a formal environmental group. She had a vice president, she had a treasurer, she had a secretary and everything. But she talks about how every one of her employees were sued by Formosa and eventually just quit. She struggled to get any local support because of how Formosa was ingrained into the community. Folks that work for Formosa obviously could not publicly complain about their employer polluting. They'd just simply be fired. City and county officials were more concerned with economic development than the water in the bay, so they would not rock the boat. People needed loans, and Formosa had people on the board of directors at the bank. When she complained about harassment, like when her boat was repeatedly vandalized and sabotaged, or when someone fired shots at her house, the police department got all new patrol cars. When she tried to get the medical community to support her, the ambulances all got new defibrillators. When she looked to clergy, all the churches got new computer systems. Formosa donated books to the schools. If you recall earlier, I mentioned that the parent company invests in educational and medical facilities. She was all alone. She talks about going to permit hearings all by herself, protesting, picketing, all by herself. She said that sometimes she'd get some support from some environmental groups out of Houston or an occasional environmental ally from out of state, usually Louisiana. The governmental agencies that should have been helping were ineffective. OSHA, it's occupational safety, I believe. She heard from plant workers that the OSHA guy would show up, the plant manager would take him out for a nice steak lunch, and would spend all of 5 minutes in the plant checking for safety issues. The EPA, the workers laughed about the EPA inspectors as well. They would give a week's notice before showing up. They would spend 5 minutes looking around the specific areas that the workers had spent the week cleaning up, and then they were gone. Diane describes a revolving door among state and federal regulators. Anyone that got too zealous would get a job offer from Formosa, ended up leaving that whatever agency they were at for a more lucrative career with Formosa. So she started out on her own, but she did find silent allies. When workers at the factory were injured, reported their injury, the factory would not help. OSHA would not help. They would show up and talk to Diane. Workers watching chemicals being flushed into the bay would call her. Frustrated Water Commission employees would funnel reports of toxic spills to her that were being ignored by their political managers. Her campaign of hunger strikes, protests, picketing, sometimes just by herself, sometimes she took her kids, 1 or 2 deckhands or fishermen, but it all eventually paid off. In 1994, she had been enough of a nuisance and generated enough negative publicity that she finally convinced Formosa Plastics to agree to spend a few more percentage points of their safety budget to install technology to achieve zero toxic discharge. She then ran over to Alcoa and got them to agree as well. So Diane continued to be a self-appointed watchdog over the heavy industry along her coast. In 1998, there was a major explosion which leaked ethylene dichloride into the air, which Diane carefully documented. Another explosion in 2005 burned for 5 days, and the local school had to be evacuated, and everyone was told to shelter in place, which Diane carefully documented. So Diane was monitoring and holding Formosa to their agreements. In 2009, Diane was contacted by a former wastewater operator from the Formosa plant. He told her about the dangers of the small plastic pellets called Nerdles and the effects that the plastic pollution had on the environment. Now, Diane had heard of Nerdles, but hadn't thought much about them. She'd been primarily concerned about the toxic chemical sludge being flushed into the bay. What the former employee was referring to is the lack of concern and lack of effort to avoid random spillage of pellets all across the 2,500-acre plant. When it rains, all the spilled pellets got swept through the stormwater drains into the bay. When the plant produces hundreds of thousands of metric tons of plastic pellets every year, the spillage is well into the tons. This meeting prompted her to investigate, and a few months later, Diane and a few other whistleblowers drove to Cox Creek to check out the problem. It was pretty obvious right away. By the boat ramp, close to where the stormwater runoff discharge pipe was, the plastic pellets were caked in the mud to a depth of 4 inches. Diane said it looked like it had hailed. Nerdles are the basic component for all plastic products. Everything is made from nerdles. They weigh a fraction of an ounce and start about the size of a pea. Over time and friction, they get smaller until they're just almost a powder. Nerdles can absorb chemicals, pesticides, DDT, PCBs, and mercury. Bacteria like E. coli colonize on the slimy biofilm that forms on submerged plastic. Fish, birds, and turtles and other wildlife mistake it for food. In Texas, the endangered Kemp's Riley sea turtle and the whooping crane, they eat the nerdles and starve to death. Their body is full of plastic that has no nutrition and cannot be digested and passed. From fish, it gets into our food supply. So Diane started contacting state regulators and filing Freedom of Information Act requests to see if Formosa had been disciplined for apparent gross violations of their permits and the Clean Water Act. After years of watching a lack of regulation or enforcement, Diane began to realize no governmental agency would challenge the polluters. Formosa Plastics, at a wastewater permit hearing, agreed that releasing nerdles into the environment would indisputably be a permit violation. They also confirmed that if nerdles were released into the water, it must be reported within 24 hours. Yet the pellets kept coming, and the company never reported any discharge. They seemed indifferent. So after years of effort, Diane decided to take matters once again into her own hands. In 2016, nearly every week, she and a handful of helpers hiked and kayaked along the banks of alligator-infested Cox Creek in search of nerdles. They collected over 2,500 samples in 2.5 years, photographing and documenting the date, time, place, and volume of the roughly 30 million nerdles they collected. Diane Wilson and the Waterkeepers Alliance, with the help of lawyers from the Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, filed a lawsuit over the Federal Clean Water Act violations. The complaint alleged that Formosa has repeatedly discharged huge numbers of nerdles into Cox Creek, but had failed to report a single incident since 2016 when they started counting. On the first day of the Waterkeeper v. Formosa trial, Diane and a few fellow kayakers lined up at the courthouse in Victoria, Texas, towing 30 storage bins containing an estimated 26 million nerdles, all painstakingly documented, cross-referenced with photographs, dates, times. The deputies, reasonably enough, refused to allow them to bring the loads of trash into the courtroom. The judge hearing the case intervened, and they agreed to store the tubs in the basement, and the judge and the lawyers would trudge downstairs to inspect them when the time came. Now, Formosa Plastics' defense was that they had permits that allowed trace amounts of pellet discharge into the waterways, but they blamed the vague language of the permits that did not specifically define what trace amounts constituted, so they were not in violation for not reporting discharges. The judge ruled that the evidence Diane had collected demonstrated that Formosa had been in violation of its permits as far as the discharge of floating solids since January 2016, when Diana started monitoring. He also described Formosa as a serial offender and faulted the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality for failing to bring the company into compliance. The company was fined $2.85 million in federal fines, and Formosa also agreed to a $50 million settlement, which was the largest in U.S. history involving a private citizen. The money will go towards programs supporting pollution mitigation, habitat restoration, public education, and other environmental efforts in the mid-Texas Gulf Coast. Diane commented that it was too little too late, pocket money for Formosa, but she did get the company to agree to implement a zero discharge floating solids policy, which she intends to continue to monitor to ensure compliance. Next, we'll share a story of a sacrifice zone in Vietnam. In 2008, Formosa Plastics, in conjunction with their Vietnamese government, opened a new steel mill in a deep water port in the Vung Ang economic zone. Vietnam is luring international investment to take advantage of their young, low-wage workforce. Just like in Texas and the EPA, economic development benefits the wealthy and overshadows the best interests and health of the local populace. In April of 2016, a massive fish die-off occurred along 125 to 150 miles of the central Vietnam coast. Vietnam's fishing agency estimates they have cleaned up over 70 tons of dead fish that washed up on their shores. It took a while to pin down the cause. The government did their best to quash any investigations by intimidating university lab researchers as well as local fishermen who were narrowing in on the culprit. It was eventually traced back to the Formosa steel plant and a massive toxic release that was carried hundreds of miles along the coast by sea currents.
Là ống xả thải nằm sâu dưới đáy đại dương của tập đoàn Formosa.
Phát hiện cái đường ống đó là cách đây đã 2 năm rồi. Thì nhưng mà nó xả thải mạnh nhất là từ trong năm nay nó xả thải mạnh.
Công ty trách nhiệm hữu hạn gang thép Hương nghiệp Formosa Hà Tĩnh đã xả lượng độc chất này ra biển.
Thì không được. Cả hai thì phải lựa chọn. Tôi muốn bắt cá bắt tôm, hay là tôi muốn xây dựng một cái.
So which do you want? To catch shrimps and fishes or a new steel plant? I guess it depends on if you work and live in that sacrifice zone. Just like in Texas, the government hampered and harassed anyone that appeared to get too close to the truth. Countless researchers, protesters, and activists, along with fishermen, are still in jail on multiple charges levied against them for speaking out. One activist that documented the Formosa spill was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The death toll from people eating contaminated fish, the sudden loss of a major human food source, the associated die-off of birds and other wildlife for whom fish is also a food source, as well as the decimation of a significant portion of the critical fishing industry, has proven to be a disaster of biblical proportion for the Vietnamese government. By July 2016, Formosa Steel owned up to the toxic spill and offered to pay $500 million to compensate for damages. However, any payments were made to the Vietnamese government, and very few dollars reached the now impoverished and starving fishermen and associated businesses that had been crippled by the die-off. Protests over the failure to distribute funds were suppressed and broken up, resulting in even more people being thrown in jail. In our last sacrifice zone, St. James Parish, Louisiana, Formosa Plastics submitted a request for permits to build a $9 billion petrochemical plant along the Mississippi River in the 5th Ward of St. James Parish, Louisiana. Ironically, they dubbed the expansion the Sunshine Project. An article in Plastics Today magazine mentions that Shell closed a refinery which cost the area 700 jobs. A new plant like Formosa Plastics would provide much needed jobs in the area. The company has already been promised $1.4 billion in local property tax exemptions and a $12 million grant to offset infrastructure costs. The plant has also been grandfathered under an old tax break program and is expected to receive 100% property tax abatement for 10 years. The article ends with, quote, Shell gave 3 generations of Parish citizens good jobs. The residents of St. James Parish should be grateful that Formosa Plastics chose their parish to build a thriving, growing industry, unquote. In videos announcing Formosa's Sunshine Project, state officials, parish officials, they're almost giddy talking about the huge influx of economic prosperity coming to the state and the parish. The plant would employ 1,200 people. That's 1,200 jobs, good paying jobs. They estimated an additional 7,000 to 8,000 periphery jobs being created. I suppose that would be like suppliers to the factory, like, you know, the uniform companies, the sparklets, water dispensers, office supplies, maybe services to support those 1,200 employees, waiters or dry cleaners, grocery clerks. Then another 7,000 to 8,000 construction jobs, even though temporary until the plant was built, they were jobs nonetheless. Once again, the economic development and job creation desires go head to head with the very real fears of toxic environment and the sacrifice of nature, of creation. While the state is proud of the ability to attract big business and the dollars they bring, most of the local residents don't feel the benefits of the economic boom. Most of that gets deposited in bank accounts higher up the ladder. They end up feeling the effects of the chemicals and how it affects their health and everyday life. This is not creating another sacrifice zone. This area is already that. Steph Curry, the basketball player, produced a documentary highlighting St. James Parish and its claim to fame as part of Cancer Alley. St. James Parish is home to 7 of the 10 most carcinogen-ridden census tracts in America. When slavery was abolished after the Civil War, there were more than 500 sugarcane plantations along the Mississippi River. In addition to slave labor, they also needed access to the river to get their goods to market. That's why you see all tracts of land positioned off the river like bowling alley lanes. Today, over 200 of those plantations are homes to some of the most polluting petrochemical facilities in the United States. The residents there breathe the most toxic air in the country and suffer some of the highest rates of cancer as well. Here, environmental degradation and cancer are the byproducts of colonialism and slavery. So if you, in this picture, make a note of that bend in the river at the very bottom. This map shows the different wards within St. James Parish. Again, take a note of that lowest bend in the river. I'll point out that Ward 5 is 85% African American.
Mm-hmm.
Ward 6 is about 50%. This map shows factory upon factory all along the river in the 5th Ward. You can see the new huge proposed Formosa factory on the left side. You see that same bend in the river down at the bottom? To the right is the 6th Ward, the ward that's 50% white. And the picture kind of cuts it off, but it seems like there's no factories there. You're right, there aren't. This map shows the recorded petrochemical accidents in a 1-year span. At least these are the reported accidents. Many go unreported. In fact, the middle of last year, it was discovered that the Nucor steel plant across the river in the 4th Ward had been quietly bleeding off cancer-causing sulfuric acid mist and hydrogen sulfide into the atmosphere for 6 years without a permit. The scary thing to me is what they would be allowed to do if they did have a permit. But getting back to the map, you can see where all the accidents occurred, all along the 5th Ward and virtually nothing to the right of that bend in the river, the 6th Ward. This would be textbook environmental racism. We know what they're spewing into the air. We know where the fumes go. We know it kills people, and yet we have a process to get permits to allow companies to pump this poison into the air. Earthworks.org has a laundry list of reasons to stop the Formosa plant beyond the blatant environmental racism. The simple in-your-face reason is the plant will be a climate killer. The Sunshine Project would emit a staggering amount of carbon into the air, estimated anywhere from 6 million up to 13 million tons of carbon pollution every year. The equivalent of building 3.5 new coal-fired plants or 2.6 million gas engine cars. The facility would be the single largest greenhouse gas emitter to be approved in more than a decade. It will also be a super polluter, spewing 800 tons of toxic emissions every year. Known carcinogens like ethylene oxide, benzene, and formaldehyde into an already deadly environment. Beyond the air quality, there is the silently encroaching plastic dump slowly strangling our oceans. Disheartening is that this sort of racism isn't a secret. It's common knowledge. Everyone knows, except maybe me, perhaps, until I started looking into it. If there aren't enough issues in the world, it's sad that the United Nations has to report on the US as if we aren't moral enough to call it out on our own. Luckily, there are groups working to prevent the Formosa plant from being built. Rise St. James is a grassroots group of residents protesting and fighting to prevent more damage to their community. They've been vocal enough about Formosa's track record as a serial polluter to make the air quality people that rubber stamp the program nervous. They have been vocal enough about the blatant environmental racism to make the staunchest economic progress diehard a little bit nervous. They have been vocal about the elementary school less than a mile from the proposed site. They have found several burial sites from the colonial slave plantations when slaves were laid to rest in unmarked and unofficial cemeteries, and they have been vocal about that. In August of last year, on a call with the Army Corps of Engineers and Rice St. James and lawyers from the Center for Biological Diversity, it appears that the Army Corps of Engineers, heeding the protests, lawsuits, and repeated calls, rescinded the approvals and permits they'd already approved and determined that a new environmental impact statement be conducted for the project. One of the lawsuits claimed that the prior environmental impact study was inadequate, and the Corps acknowledged several errors and inconsistencies as a reason for their change of heart. This 2-year delay is an important step to killing the project once and for all. Meanwhile, the organizations working to save their community will continue their work. While it's easy to make Formosa the villain, we have to admit that it is consumers like us that drive the demand for plastic products. Things that are ingrained into our daily lives, like bottled water. The bottle that nearly every product we buy comes in: cleaner, shampoo, floor polish, dish soap. Fruits, vegetables, meat, all wrapped in plastic. Every fast food purchase seems to come with a plastic straw and plastic forks and knives, or the mind-boggling spork. And our grande, iced skinny mocha frappuccino with extra shot and caramel drizzle. In order to have all that plastic, remember, areas negatively impacted by environmental degradation and/or pollution that harms nearby residents for broader economic gains elsewhere. We are most probably the elsewhere and economic gains elsewhere. We need to be mindful of our plastic use. Next time you go to the store, before you check out, look in your basket. Count up how much plastic you just purchased. The first step is to realize the sacrifice zones occur because our elected representatives assume that that's what we want, what we expect. We are called on to vote for candidates that understand that we do not condone that policy. Next, Brad is going to share some experiences that he had in Cancer Alley.
Brad, you're muted.
Thank you, Lori. I was just running through it one more time before I did it live. So 24 years ago, my wife Lori and I, we were working on our master's degree in environmental education through the Audubon Expedition Institute and Lesley University. We traveled and we studied in regions throughout the US, northern Mexico, and eastern Canada. During the winter-spring semester of 1998, we were learning about the racial, cultural, and ecological issues of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and as Paul mentioned, Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is the 80-mile-plus strip of land along the Mississippi River between New Orleans to the south and Baton Rouge to the north, where low-income minority communities exist side by side with nearly 150 oil refineries, plastic plants, and chemical facilities. We met Florence Robinson, an activist and a professor of biology at Southern University. She had been fighting against toxic waste since the early 1970s when her and her family moved to Elson, a predominantly Black community. Florence showed us how environmental racism was used to justify the poisoning of Elson and other Black communities of Baton Rouge. We went to Devil Swamp Lake. Florence and her family had enjoyed walking and watching wildlife there. But over time, she observed the growing number of dead fish floating in greasy films on the surface of the water. She learned in 1964 an industrial pit had been dug in Elson to dispose of hazardous waste. The runoff from this hazardous waste pit was seeping into Devil's Swamp Lake and was further contaminated, as you can see, by all the kind of more white and areas that was being further contaminated by 11 nearby petrochemical plants and commercial hazardous waste incinerator and several waste landfills. In 2004, Devil's Swamp Lake was designated an EPA Superfund site due to PCBs, mercury, lead, arsenic, and other chemicals. Elson, this is an interesting comparison to what Paul just shared in the communities around New Orleans. Elson, after the Civil War, was home to newly freed slaves, where they had cool, clean water and healthy, productive lands. But that all changed in 1964 for their children, grandchildren, and generations to come. In elementary school, Florence explained that children are exposed to lead not only through the toxic air quality, but by playing in bare soil areas of playgrounds, around their houses, and vacant lots with piles of hazardous waste. In the more rural areas, she talked about farmers who are losing livestock due to the pollutants. Florence introduced us to a number of people fishing along the Mississippi River. They knew the fish were toxic, but they had little choice as they needed to feed themselves and their families. And they also grew gardens, knowing that the food they grew was also contaminated. They had little to no choice since the spare money that they did have was paying for utilities, mortgages, rents, and medical bills. They talked about their family and family members, skin rashes, upper respiratory problems, fatigue, depression, reduced brain functioning, and the cancers. It broke my heart and my spirit listening to Florence and the other stories of disempowerment, and injustice in their home, as their home had become yet another sacrifice zone. Remember, this was 1998, before the devastation of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and lesser hurricanes and tropical storms since then. I can only imagine how much worse that the toxins have been further spread and concentrated in certain areas by these storms and future ones. In 1998, as a pioneer for the Louisiana environmental movement, Florence was awarded the 5th Heinz Award for the environment. In a quote, she said, "We couldn't even vote when the planning for most of this was taking place. Those decisions were made when we were disfranchised, and we were deliberately denied the opportunity to voice our opinions. That's environmental racism," unquote. Today, Dean and Susie has shared their experience of 1969 in the roadside neighborhood of Des Moines, Iowa, a neighborhood that suffered from racial discrimination, lack of environmental protection, governmental and industrial redlining through unjust planning and policies, and denial of financial resources. To this day, roadside still bears ecological and racial scars, reminders of white privilege and power. Paula gave us a look into Formosa Plastics and how they are creating and/or exploiting sacrifice zones in Texas, Vietnam, Louisiana, as well as other places in the United States and globally. As a serial global polluter, they have severely impacted the ecological processes of fisheries, avian life, and people and their cultures and their livelihoods. Activists like Diane Wilson and others have fought back, but Formosa keeps manufacturing and polluting to satisfy our plastic craze-driven economies and consumerism. And I have shared of my experience in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, of how blatant disregard for human and ecological life is devastating vulnerable communities of color along the nefarious Cancer Alley. Our stories, and those that were presented on March 20th, are indicative examples of environmental racism, each bearing deep scars and fresh wounds of 16th century colonialism and today's neo-colonialism. The highlights how some governmental policies and regulations support and protect companies and industries over the health and well-being of their citizens and creation. They show how some companies driven by profits, global economic demands, and unrelenting consumerism choose cheaper practices of exploitation, impoverishment, and destruction to people and planet. And many local and global financial institutions cater to investments in industrial developments versus the development of affordable housing and building safe, diverse, and just communities. There are stories of discrimination, oppression, greed, ecological destruction, and blatant disregard of human life and culture. So what is the connection between environmental racism and global climate crisis? The answer is everything. Environmental racism has played a significant role intentionally and unintentionally for centuries and even now through today's neocolonialism, industrialization, technicalization, I know that's not a word, and consumerism, leading to increased carbon emissions and toxins globally. Thus, the climate crisis we face today. So we have a few minutes, and I invite anyone who would like to offer a question or share a comment to please keep those to a sentence or two. And so we'll now open it up to any comments or questions. I see Tom.
Yes. Tom says that the three speakers today are excellent. They've done their homework to educate me, to keep me informed, and to challenge me. So the three of you get my applause over and over again and keep coming back to this program.
Thank you, Tom. Let's see. Other questions or comments?
Karen Wade had her hand up.
Oh, okay.
I was just applauding.
Yes.
All right. Jody, or were you just waving?
I know from some of the stories that the rest of you have shared after Dean and Susie's presentation, that you're very aware of your local communities and places that are experiencing environmental racism. And I think your stories and our stories, they need to be shared. They need to be shared wider and larger. It's just not us, say presenters, but all of you. You have stories to share. So I just encourage you to continue to do that.
Kathy Sharp has her hand up.
Okay. Kathy?
Yes, I just was going to say, in terms of eco-racism, the reason our climate change has come to such a crisis is because these flagrant attacks on our environment are invisible to the white majority culture to a large extent. As was pointed out earlier, if these kinds of chemical plants, etc., were in our neighborhoods, we would be paying attention and we would be raising holy hell. And so both issues, both racism and climate crisis, have to be dealt with simultaneously so that those voices are uplifted and the voices of minority communities are elected into positions of power. It's just all interrelated and intersectional.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point to make about sharing our stories, but also advocacy, and to be involved how you can at the political level, both locally, state level, province level, and nationally, and globally. Are there other questions or comments? Oh, the O'Daniels? Yes. Yeah, I can unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay. Living in a rural area in Iowa, one of the big things that we are dealing with right now, and the legislature has recently passed a bill that's good for a year regarding the laying of pipelines under our wonderfully productive farmland. And that is the deal of allowing corporations to use eminent domain, which is a governmental process, not a private corporate process. This has been now delayed for a year to allow the farmers and other concerned people to debate and hopefully make the legislature aware that for Iowa, which produces much of the grain products for the country, is not just selfish, but is looking at the impact around the country and around the world. I write letters, and I heard one person maybe 2 months ago say that the time that you spend composing your letter is not as valuable as if you went out and stood on the picket line. Did I hear that correctly? I do not have the capabilities at this point to stand in the line. I support a number of environmental groups, and whenever I see these kinds of things that seem to me to be certainly derogatory to a variety of ethnic groups, of living conditions, I write my letters. And I guess what I'm looking for is that helpful? Is that not helpful? Am I wasting my time?
You're not. Yes, all kinds of communication, whether it's through letters, postcard campaigns, calling, emails, all these are very beneficial. And being a person that has been an advocate, I've met with senators and representatives, and I've also written letters and phone calls. Tomorrow, I'm going to be on a hearing locally for a public issue that's happening here in where I live in Lacey, Washington. But yes, all of that is very, very beneficial. And the more of us who get involved at any level helps make put pressure for better decisions. And are you referring to the intimate domain to take away farmland to bury carbon tunnels or carbon stashes in Iowa?
That's what it is right now, is the carbon.
Yeah. We probably have room for one more question, and then we'll have to transition. Thank you. Oh, yes, Michael Clark. I see your hand.
Just unmute myself. Yeah, we have that problem in England about pollution in our rivers and our freshwater rivers and stuff. So we have that here too. I guess you have it all over the world. Mm-hmm. Someone was speaking about plastic waste, and being a member of Extinction Rebellion in UK, I have friends that when they go shopping, before they leave the store, they unwrap all their stuff from the plastic wrappings and leave it in store. And sometimes that's got them into trouble, but sometimes they've spoke to the manager and it's been okay about it. So maybe that's something you can try there.
That's an interesting way, kind of a direct protest. However, they're just probably just going to throw it away in their garbage cans. So yeah. Well, thank you, Michael. All right. Thank you all for your questions and comments. I'll now turn it over to Lori.
I guess on behalf of the rest of the team, I just really also want to add my thanks to all that we've heard today, and especially to all of you who come. I'm just really aware of how much is already happening among us. We're not at the beginning of this process of trying to turn the world around. We are on the way. But I also want to recognize that I got to really watch my time here. As I listen to these stories, both this week and from a couple of weeks ago, there really is something that stirs in me that's a mixture of recognizing really harsh truths. There's still part of me that's squirming at my entanglement in these systems and the entitlement that's afforded to me by being entangled in these systems. Recoiling from those places where I have to also own the fact of my own complicity. There's also wanting to be different, feeling a need to act differently and more reverently going forward. And then finally, although there are a lot of places where all of us are working in different ways, there's still this feeling of not even knowing really all that I could be doing. What attracts me by these stories is the resilience and wisdom of the people who these stories have been about. Mayor Julian Mai, Diane Wilson, Florence Robinson that was just shared with us. Persons that powers that be would like to marginalize, but who have in them a sureness about who they are that rises up no matter how they're put down or what kind of oppression they may have endured. So I'm really interested in how beautiful God-beloved people without outsider help find their own self-dignity and how they express that self-dignity and discovery of their own intrinsic worth over and against those voices that seek to suppress them, to exploit them, to manipulate them in service of a predatory social economic system. I want to learn from them, and to learn from them requires a couple of words that we don't like to hear. Because I think our words about our spiritual practices and even our words about God have been co-opted by the forces of colonialism. They've been made vertical. They have created a repulsion in us for some of the places where there's actually wisdom about how we could address these issues from the heart. One of those words is humility. To hear these stories about what is at best white entitlement, if not outright white supremacy, stirs us to acknowledge the truth of our own complicity, as I said. But here's the deal. We have to be able to do that without getting so mired in guilt that we become powerless to change or act. And that's what I really want to speak to. Because I know guilt shows up, at least in my heart, and I doubt that I'm alone in that. How to acknowledge the truth, how to learn from each other, how to hold that knowledge, but not allowing ourselves to become enthralled to the guilt and to the shame that those same systems of power use to keep us from really acting fully. The Buddhist systems theorist Joanna Macy says in her book, Act of Hope, that if we will simply recognize the ways we contribute to the unraveling of our world, we can also identify choice points where we can turn towards the world's healing. And then in her very next sentence, she invites us into a bigger story to throw ourselves into what she calls the great turning, a global shift in consciousness that is already underway, that's made up of all the small steps, the letter writing, the protest, the choosing a different product at the store, how all those small steps can come together and create something new. Which brings me to another one of those abused words that I think might need to be renewed in our community of faith. And that word is the word repentance. Repentance is, in the best sense, simply about turning away from that which brings death and turning towards that which brings life and healing. It doesn't need to have this pejorative that, oh, I'm not of worth. Oh, I need to wallow in shame. Oh, I need to do nothing because it's so overwhelming, or I feel so paralyzed. A better understanding of both of these words that we shun because they have been colonialized and robbed of their true meaning and power might be essential to the way we practice environmental healing today. So I'm running short on time. I had a couple of examples of that. I do want to recognize that Pope Francis just this week used those words of guilt and shame and said, I want to use these to ask forgiveness, and with a group of Indigenous First Peoples from Canada, apologized on behalf of the church for the Catholic priests' involvement in the government-run schools that robbed Indigenous peoples of their language, their culture, their life, and their learning. And that that request for forgiveness was well received and followed with, and what comes next in terms of true reconciliation. And so my understanding is that he's planning to go to Canada and extend that recognition of complicity to the Indigenous First Peoples of Canada in person. These are the kinds of things that I just really want to bring up. The last thing I want to say is that as we consider these words, the possibility of the kind of humility that allows us to really learn from these persons who have direct experience with oppression that we have not ourselves had, we can learn humility, but we don't need to think of it as heavy or depressing, the way we've kind of been taught to think of, so we wouldn't practice it. Robin Moore-Kimmerer, who's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and a trained botanist, was asked in a lecture at Gonzaga University just a couple weeks ago about this urgency of climate change and what it would take. And she said this: it requires a virtue rare in our society, and that virtue is humility. We live in a time of tremendous arrogance, don't we? Including the intellectual arrogance of the Western worldview that says, well, this is the only way, we have to do it this way. But she says, if we live our lives with humility, and when she said that word, she was 3 hours distant, she was really tired. Her face just lit up with the word humility. And that's what I really want to communicate today. She said, oh man, it's so much more fun because you learn so much more. You can be open to so much more. You can be curious. You can celebrate what you learn, and then you can take it and make a change and difference in the world. So let us, as we come to consider these issues in environmental racism, be open and curious, willing to listen and learn, willing to confess and turn from what was to what can be. And let us participate in this great turning together in kinship with all the peoples and all the more than human peoples of this earth. So that's my invitation to us. And again, with just deep thanks to all of you and the hearts that you carry that are already moving towards that great turning and laying groundwork. That's all I got to say for now.
Just a final reminder that the next event that we'll be participating in is the April 24th Beyond the Walls worship service. We invite and encourage all of you to participate. The link, I think the opportunity for registration is on our website, and you can go to their website as well. And actually, it's not on this screen, but somebody might remind us.
Centerplace.ca.
Yes.
With that, I think our session is concluded, other than an opportunity for folks to say goodbye.